All right, I want to welcome everyone to our adult education class this morning. Welcome those folks who are on Zoom. And today we have the privilege of hearing from our own Rob Wescott, who will be speaking about where the world economy is going and inflation and global geopolitical risks. Rob is a simple little talk today. Rob is no stranger to PPC. He's well known to all of us. Founder and president of Keybridge Research, a 25-person firm based in Washington that Rob started 20 years ago. He spent 4 years at the White House as the president's top international economic advisor and also as chief economist at the President's Council of Economic Affairs. Couple of little known facts that may give you an idea that he may know what he's talking about. Rob met Vladimir Putin on his third day on the job as Prime Minister of Russia and overall had about 8 in-person meetings with him. Rob also helped to negotiate China's entry in the World Trade Organization back in 2000. Rob has a PhD from University of Pennsylvania in economics. So we're going to start our morning with a word of prayer. Holy One, we know you are present here with us this morning, and we're so grateful for your mercies that are new every morning. And we're so grateful for your faithfulness. I pray, Lord, that as we gather in this way, that you would anoint Rob with your Holy Spirit as he speaks and teaches and leads us in the way that you know we need to go, as he opens our eyes to what is going on in the world. Lord, we know you are sovereign and Lord of all, and we praise you for that promise and that gift. Stir among us now, be our teacher and our guide, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. Amen.
Bob, are these seats being saved for Putin and the Chinese?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
So thank you, Emily. I would just like to say right off the start, there's a lot of nervousness in the world today. I think you all know that. So I brought 3 of the last 5 days of Washington Post headlines. So this one, global signs of growing signs of a global slump. This one from Friday, stock market's long slide continues. Now, this is actually yesterday's stuff. Stock market's long slide continues. And this morning's the Fed admits it's short on answers. So now you know why we've gathered you here today. We are going to figure out what Jay Powell and the Fed don't know. So what I'd like to do is, I know this nervousness, I don't have magic wand to wave to make the world's problems go away. I'm not a financial advisor, so do not take anything I say to buy or sell stocks or something. But what I would like to do is give us a little framework of thinking about what's going on in the world and talk about kind of how we got here and where we might be going. So that's my goal today. And if we can have I have the slide clicker here. I'd just like to start with a picture of Vladimir Lenin. This is 100 years ago. He said, sometimes there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think we would all say that the last 30 weeks have been the weeks when decades have happened, because the world has dramatically changed in the last 30 weeks. We've got surging energy prices. We've got probably a recession in Europe already starting because of the surge of energy prices in Europe. And we've got a boost to inflation. So we've got central banks raising interest rates, and that's making stock markets go down. So we're going to get into all that today. So my agenda is, I've talked about the US first, just a few drivers of the US economy. And then there are 4 critical things that I think we need to watch, and we'll talk about those. So it's Russia and Europe, it's inflation, it's China's economic slowdown, and it's the future of the globalization model. So we'll get into that. And then a few thoughts about world recession risks and what that might mean. And then we're going to turn it open to you, and we'll have general discussion. So I'll talk for maybe about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have some general questions. I hope that works for folks. And let me just start with the US right off the bat. Before Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, US economy was doing pretty well. We were in line for pretty healthy growth. Consumers were leading the way, manufacturers were leading the way, but war and surging energy prices are not good for growth. So we were expecting about 3.5% growth before Putin's invasion of Russia, and now we think this year we'll see about 1.5% growth. So it has had a major impact on the US economy. And this is the one most complicated chart I will show, but I think this is really, really important to understand where we are, where the US economy is. This is a chart that shows the top line is disposable income. I am an economist, so we have to have at least one complicated chart. The top line is disposable income. That's the income that people earn. And the bottom line is consumer expenditures. This is what we spend. And this is 70% of the economy right here, what consumers spend. So if you look over here at what was going on before March 2020, everything was in line. Income was rising 4.2% a year. Consumer spending was increasing 4.1% a year. Everything was orderly. We understood it. Everything was going fine. And then COVID hit. And you can see consumer spending collapsed. So this is March 13th, 2020. What did we do? We all went to our houses. We locked the front door and we didn't come out for a couple of months. So this blue area down here, this is the restaurant meal you did not go to. It's the movie you did not go to. It's the trip you did not take. So this was, we understand this pretty well. The dramatic part of this chart is the top. This is the what happened to income. Normally it would go down as we were going through all that slowdown. But this is what $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus looks like when it hits households. $1,200 checks, $600 checks, $1,400 checks. This is money that the government put into the system. By the way, I just want to make one point clear. This is not a Republican or Democratic thing. The first two checks were under President Trump. The third check was under President Biden. So basically, there was a national consensus. We have to put money into people's pockets. This was PPP program and so on. We still have about 1.9 trillion of dry powder left in the economy. This is people are now spending their money, and this is the Norvells going on their cruise to Sweden. This is the vacation house you rented to have a family vacation after not having a vacation for 2 years with your kids. And you can see this money has now been bleeding out into the economy, and we're actually starting to see signs of stress in this income. People have been pumping out the money that they didn't spend under COVID, but costs are going up because of inflation, and we're starting to bleed out this money. And so that's an area of concern about the economy going forward. Now, the other part of the economy.
What is dry powder? Is that just
that's money that's still in people's bank accounts that they could spend.
Okay,
It's an old person's term.
dry gunpowder?
Yes, it is exactly dry gunpowder.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Gunpowder?
So the other thing that's been happening is the labor market has rapidly healed. So this chart here, this is monthly change of employment in America. This is 20 million people losing their jobs in the single month of April 2020. Of course, this is one of the reasons why we put all that fiscal stimulus into the system, because we lost 20 million jobs in 1 month. We've now been clawing our way back. We have now reattained the prior level of employment. We're actually above that now. The unemployment rate is back to where it was before the pandemic hit. And most sectors of the economy have now healed and are actually back in organic growth. One exception is leisure and hospitality. We're still about 2 million workers down in hotels and travel. One other area is kind of interesting is healthcare is still about 400,000 people down from where it was before the pandemic hit. But most other sectors have come back. So the labor market has really healed with a couple of exceptions. It's healed so much that we've actually got what we're calling the Great Resignation going on, or what has been the Great Resignation. So we have about 11 million job openings in America right now, and we have about 6 million unemployed people. So there are 1.9 job openings for every unemployed person. And that's by far the record. This data goes back 70 years. We've never been anywhere near close to that number of job openings per person. So this is one of the reasons why almost 3% of people have been quitting their jobs each month. It's also one of the reasons why wage demands are up sharply. So this is wage demands. This goes back 40 years. And you can see what's happened to wage demands. They're now up almost 7% year on year. So we've seen a surge of people asking for higher wages. Of course, this is now going to get to our inflation story. But tight labor market, workers asking for larger pay raises, and you can see why the Fed is now concerned, because this has like just been exploding compared to the average of the last 40 years. Now, wages represent 70% of business costs. So if you're paying 70% more to your workers, suddenly you may have to raise your prices if you're a business, and that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of the inflation story. So that's a little background on the US economy. I now want to just talk about 4 things to watch, critical factors to watch. First one is the Russia-Ukraine war. We have to talk about that and what that means for the world. Second is rising inflation and Fed tightening. The third is China's growth slowdown. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is the global business model under threat. So we'll get into that. And let's just start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is the quickest way I can think to bring the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to bear on where the world economy is going. This is a chart that's the world's oil bill. Okay, so this is all the oil in the world times the price of oil. This is like 100 million barrels a day we're using times the price of oil times 365 days divided by world GDP. Okay, so this is the world's oil bill. And if you go back, this goes back to the 70s. You can see when the world's oil bill gets above 4%, we typically, and this is just a regularity of the last 70 years. Go back to the years of 1980, 81, 82. Those are the worst 3 years back to back for the world economy since the Great Depression years of 1933, 34, 35. So not a coincidence. This is 2008. I know many people would say, oh yes, I remember the great financial recession of 2008. I remember what caused it. It was, what did most people say? It was, well, yes, it was Lehman Brothers. It was the Lehman collapse. And most people would say that. Yeah, actually, no. The price of oil went to $147 a barrel in the spring of 2008. It hit $147 in June. The U.S. economy went into recession in June of 2008. Lehman collapsed in September. So
how about the price of homes?
Price of homes was zooming too, Dal. But this is one of the key factors that was causing the recession. So we were already in recession before Lehman. Putin's invasion of Russia has taken oil from about $65 a barrel. It took to 139 very quickly. We don't know where this will end up for the year. We're down now in the 90s, but we're certainly in range of an economic slowdown. And the U.S. economy had zero growth, had negative growth in the first 2 quarters of 2020. Not a coincidence. This is related to surging price of global oil. Now, another effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a big cutback in global food supply. So Russia and Ukraine together were responsible for between 20% and 25% of wheat exports, of corn exports, and these have been greatly impacted. Esme, who's a member of this class, ambassador from Malawi to the US, she has her president here this week. I was talking to her a couple of weeks ago. I said, what are the biggest problems that your president is facing in Malawi? She said, 2 big problems: price of energy, price of food. And so you can see it coming straight from a very direct line from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to global challenges.
And we protect your players seriously.
Yes, yes. So Russia has cut off exports of natural gas to Western Europe. You know that. He's been playing games like, oh, we have to cut back. We have a mechanical problem. We have to have a maintenance issue. But basically, gas has greatly, has more or less ended. And the price of natural gas was about $6 to $8 a million BTUs in Europe before Russia's invasion. And now it's $60 to $80 a million BTUs. So it's increased 10 times. And the price of natural gas has gone up so much that you cannot even turn on an industrial plant in Europe now. So Mittal, the big steel company, 2 weeks ago shut their steel their steel making plant in Germany. These are some of the plants that have been closed in Europe because of the high prices of natural gas. And we believe that Europe is now in recession just because of the cutback of industrial production. You can't shut down all your industrial plants and not have a recession. And that's one of the things that is making people nervous. It's not declared as an official recession yet in Europe, but this is one of the things that we need to keep our eye on. Look at industrial production in Germany, UK. I think those are the two first countries that are going to recession in Europe. Southern Europe, like Italy, Spain, are doing a little better still, but they're being pulled down by the price of energy in Europe. Now let's go on to inflation. And so we're going back to the US at this point. And surging oil prices have boosted US inflation as well. This is a consumer price index for the last 70 years. So in the last 70 years, we've had two times when inflation was higher, in the two oil price surges in the 1970s and early 1980s. But we're here. Even though CPI was 9.1% in June, and it's dipped a little bit to 8.3, we're still basically the highest inflation in 40 years and one of the highest rates of inflation in 70 years. So this is become the new big problem. And I think everyone knows that. If you go to the food store, you know that. Where did this inflation come from? Well, economists have four main theories of what has caused inflation. And I'm just going to give you the 30-second version of this, okay? The first explanation is aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. We've been overheating the economy. You saw those spikes of the $1,200 checks and the $1,400 checks and so on. They're part of this story. I don't know if people realize it, but after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. went into wartime footing in 1942. We had a big surge of fiscal spending for the militarization of the American economy. The spending that we put in after COVID hit, the first 12 months after COVID, was larger than the increase of spending in 1942. So in 1943, the spending was a little bit larger than under COVID, but the ranking of the biggest fiscal stimuluses to the American economy were number one, 1943, number two, COVID, number three, 1942. We put a lot of money in the system. In my opinion, a lot of this money was poorly focused. I mean, at our company of 25 people, no one lost their job, no one lost their health care, but everyone got $4,000 checks, or the people below the 85,000 got stimulus checks. We have students with student loan repayments. They got a pause on their student loan repayments, so about $6,000 a year on average. So in the first 2 years, a lot of our staff would have had $4,000 of government checks and maybe $12,000 of student loans they didn't have to pay back at that time. And that put a lot of spending into the economy. So that's one thing that we do think was a key driver of inflation. Second cause of inflation was cost push inflation. That's what we call it as economists. And this is like oil prices. If the price of one thing goes up, it can spill over and affect the price of everything. So when diesel goes to $6 a gallon and Safeway trucks have to pay more to get the food to the Safeway down the street, or the Walgreens, costs more to get delivery, they raise their prices. And that's the second explanation for inflation that economists have. A third is wage price spiral. And we talked about that. When workers are getting more wages at 70% of the cost of running a business, businesses have to raise their costs. And the fourth explanation is monetary economics. This is Milton Friedman's views that if you print too much money, you will make inflation. And the Fed expanded its asset base from $4 trillion to $9 trillion over COVID. So this was the Fed pumping money into the system, buying government bonds, buying mortgage-backed securities. The Fed even bought like Ford Motor Company credit over this time. Now, economists typically would have a big fight, say, oh, well, it was more this one than this one, or more that one than that one. But the truth is, all four of these have been pointing in the direction of higher inflation for the last 2 years. So we could have, if you want to get into a big debate, we can start talking about the shares, but all of them have been contributing to higher inflation. In fact, we couldn't have manufactured inflation better if we'd been trying the last couple of years. A couple of special factors that have also played a role. We've had cheap imports, especially from China, for the last 30 years. So many economists would say that cheap imports from China took about a percentage point out of US inflation for the last 30 years. So all those years we were having 2% inflation and 2%, it would have been 3% and 3%, except for cheap imports from China. And this shows for like 25 years, the price of non-energy imports were basically flat, even as overall CPI was going up. Well, what's happened? China's wages have gone up sharply, and they're now starting to catch up. And so costs coming out of China have been going up. You can see import prices have been going up, and this is part of the story. So one explanation is the end of disinflation from China has been adding to inflation. And then two other things I just will mention. One is during COVID, we stopped going to movies and restaurants and traveling, but we did all want to buy a backyard trampoline for the kids. Robert, I don't know, did you guys get a trampoline for the kids in the backyard? We wanted to get backyard heaters, we wanted bicycles, we wanted all these things. And we've indexed goods and services to where they were just before before COVID hit, and you can see goods are still elevated relative to services. So we basically all wanted that bicycle at the same time. We wanted the backyard trampoline at the same time, and that was a cause of inflation. Another cause of inflation, a contributing factor, was supply chain problems and not having enough semiconductors, and you all know this. This is a chart here that shows auto inventories and the average selling price of a new car. And as we had the supply chain problems of not getting enough semiconductors, auto inventories went to zero. This is totally unprecedented. But our salesman at Oarsman Chevrolet in March said, Rob, normally I have 250 new cars for sale on the lot. I have 2 in August, in March of 2022.
Wow.
As inventories go down, there's zero inventory. What do you think happens to price? It's gone up about $4,000 per car as inventories have collapsed. And it's like, you want a new car? You can have it, but it's going to be a $4,000 premium. So that's been part of the cause of inflation as well. Unfortunately, inflation is becoming embedded more and more in the American economy. And this is something that we look at. In 2021, the Fed was saying, no, it's just temporary factors, it's transitory. And you remember all that debate? And we were telling our clients, no, absolutely not. It's becoming embedded in the economy. And we constructed our company's Keybridge, we constructed our Keybridge top 25 CPI categories to watch. So we selected the key items of the consumer price index. These are about 60% of the weight of the CPI that are not supply constrained. Okay, so we were not looking at gasoline and new cars. We're looking at other things. We looked at rent, wireless telephone service. There's no reason why wireless telephone service should be dependent on was supply constrained. We're looking at insurance. We're looking at your water bill. We're looking at taking your dog to the vet. So these are the items that we've been looking at, and we've been looking at the annual rate of increase of these items. And even back when the Fed was saying it was all transitory, this is the light blue line. It's like, this is February 2021. We're like, no, it's up. It's 4%, it's 5%, it's 6%, it's 7%, going to 8%. And so when the Fed was saying it was all temporary, we're like, no, it's not. This is our measure of underlying inflation in the economy. And what will happen is gasoline prices can go down. That's great. New car prices can go down. That's great. But if the vet has raised his fee to take you to see your dog from $85 to $100, he doesn't go back to 85. It stays up. And so that's what we're seeing. And so we are concerned that inflation is becoming more embedded in the American economy. And the Fed is now, it's really in the last couple of months, the Fed has now come to this realization. Again, we were telling our clients this in middle of 2021, and the Fed just took a while to get there, but they are now getting very concerned that inflation is becoming embedded in the economy. Now, we know from micro data that it is affecting behavior. Higher prices are affecting behavior. So this is the percentage of people who are changing their purchasing patterns. So you go to the Safeway, a can of Campbell's tomato soup is $1.79. A can of Safeway brand tomato soup is 99 cents. People are switching. So we know, we can tell from the consumer patterns that people are feeling constrained in their budgets. There was an article in the Financial Times a couple of days ago. Beyond Beef is about $9 a pound. Hamburger is $4.50. The market for like Beyond Beef and meats, plant substitutes has collapsed. And many of these companies may go out of business because the demand is collapsed because they're more expensive than other items. And people are shifting away from more expensive items. New York Fed has a survey, is it becoming difficult to pay your regular household expenses? 40% of Americans now say that they are having difficulty paying their ordinary expenses. It was 25% last summer, in the summer of 2021. So we are starting to see the inflation creating stress for households. So the Fed is now getting it, and they are now raising rates sharply because they know that they've gotten behind the curve with inflation. And they're now saying that, they're expecting the Fed funds rate, which is their monetary policy rate, to be between 4.25% and 4.75% by early 2023. So the Fed is going to still raise interest rates even several times more between now and the end of the year. I think they are still behind the curve. And this is the way I like to think about monetary policy. I like to look at the real federal funds rate. So this is the Fed's interest rate that it charges minus the rate of inflation, okay? And to me, a neutral Fed funds rate is around 1%. So 1 to 2% is a neutral Fed funds rate, and a 3 to 4 real federal funds rate is tight, and a real federal funds rate of 0 or so is highly stimulative. And we've even after the Fed raised rates this week, we're still at -3. So we are still in a highly stimulative monetary policy stance by my book. We can have debate on this because this doesn't make it the right view. This is just Wescott's view. Okay. So, but I believe the Fed is still behind the curve, and that's really why I think stock market are getting very nervous, because I think they're starting to realize that this kind of analysis may be more correct than the Fed's prior analysis. That a little bit of raising rates and everything would be fine. This is a picture of William McChesney Martin. He's the former governor of the Fed in the 1950s and 60s. And he has this great quote. He says, "The Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl just when the party gets going good." And so you're probably saying, well, what is a party? What does a party look like? What's going? So I have here two measures, the S&P 500 index and the Case-Shiller home price index. In the last 2 years, home prices are up about 40% nationwide. Stock market was up about 60% nationwide, 60%. So I would argue these things are related to zero interest rates. I know many people would say, my house is worth 20% more than last year because I put really nice shrubs in the front yard, or I picked a really nice house on a nice street. That's why it's up 40%. Or you'll say, my stocks are up 60% because I did really good research and I picked the right companies. No, actually, zero interest rates sustained year after year, and especially $5 trillion of Fed asset purchasing were behind the party. They did make a party, and the Fed is now trying to take the party away. It's trying to take the punch bowl away. There's a big debate out there. Is there such a thing as immaculate disinflation? What does that mean? It means no pain. The Fed just calibrates things perfectly, and we raise rates just enough, and we get inflation worked out of the system, but no one loses their job. There's no pain. And unfortunately, that's not possible. And Jay Powell, his language has shifted greatly in this direction, even the last week. In Jackson Hole at the end of August, he basically said for the first time, yeah, we may have to raise the unemployment rate some, and some people may lose their jobs. This is the core of the debate right now. I think the Fed is behind the curve. They have to raise rates more, and we are going to, unfortunately, the economy is going to have to take a punch in the gut. And if you're going to get inflation down, you see those wage demands surging and so on, and something is going to have to be done. I think the Fed is now on the case. We're already seeing housing reacting to mortgage rates gone from 3% to 6%. This is housing starts. They're down sharply since May. This is homes sold in all U.S. metro areas. You can see we're now below zero. So I expect we're going to see more softening of the housing market over the next 6 months and 12 months. Also, the other big question is the stock market. And this goes back, this is data from 1968 to 73. So that was the last time, one of the last times we had a big Fed, we had an inflation increase, and the Fed was raising interest rates. So in 1968, inflation was 2%. By 1971, it was 6%. It was increasing sort of like it has today. The Fed raised rates sharply. And the stock market, just for folks to know, went down 35%. So, the stock market yesterday or Friday was down 20% roughly, year to date. You can't rule out that it could go down 35%, just if it's in line with historical patterns of when the Fed goes through a serious interest rate increase cycle. It could lead to that kind of a change of stock prices. Let's quickly I want to quickly comment on China's economy. So many people China has been holding up the world economy for most of the last 20 years. It's been contributing about a third of world economic growth. Of the aggregate world economic growth has been coming from China the last 20 years. China's economy is slowing. There are a couple of special effects right now. One is the zero tolerance COVID lockdown policies in China, and they are hurting production. And if you're locked in your apartment, you're not going to restaurant meals and movies in China either. And at one point we had 400 million Chinese in lockdown. Now we have about 30 million Chinese in lockdown, but we still have a number of Chinese cities that are in lockdown, and they're losing just production, but losing consumer spending and so on when they do that. There's also been a worst in 100-year drought in China. The Yangtze River is dried up, and there are portions of China's Sichuan province gets 100% of its electricity from hydropower, and they're basically losing all their hydropower. So they've been shutting factories in China because of a lack of electricity. So this is hurting industrial production in China. We're on a downward slope. More importantly, in China is the collapse of the real estate market. So there are now 90 million empty apartments in China. The market has been overbuilt, and basically the chickens are coming home to roost in terms of the housing market in China. We have real estate price indexes now steadily declining. Much of this data is still kind of camouflaged, but there's no question but the housing market is taking a severe hit. Evergrande and some of the other debt-ridden big builders are in bankruptcy or defaulting on their bonds, and there's no easy solution to this problem. In the past, China has turned on the credit spigot and said, build more houses, build more houses. But we're now at a point where people know that housing prices may go down, and we don't need like 91, 92 million empty apartments. So the housing sector in the US is about 4% of GDP. In China, it's about 25% of GDP. So the housing sector has been a key part of the Chinese economic miracle the last 30 years, but we're basically running out of gas in terms of building more houses, more houses, more houses. One more thing, I don't know if people realize, this is consumer confidence in China. It's just collapsed. And I think that the world hasn't really fully understood the slowing of economic activity in China. The youth unemployment rate in China is 25%. And even at that, we have a Chinese research. I have a Chinese research assistant who says, Rob, do you know that all the university graduates in China now are being required to sign a document? They're forcing them to be like a DoorDash delivery person or an Uber, or many of them, and say, why are they doing that? And they give them a couple hours of work, and they say, oh, for the unemployment statistics, if you're considered an independent contractor, you're not considered unemployed. So we're getting to a funny season in China now, with President Xi on the verge of getting his third 5-year term in October, but the statistics are not probably very reliable in China right now. And so there are games being played with measuring things at this time. Lastly, I just want to comment on the globalization business model, which I see is under threat. What is the globalization business model? Well, it is free flow of goods, services, people. It is national treatment for your business. Profits can be repatriated back home, but it is basically moving to lowest cost production. And the globalization business model, many people would say this is the China, produce it in China because it's cheaper model. And that has been the dominant economic pattern for the world for the last 30 years. It is now coming under threat, the globalization business model. The first is, and this has been going about 10 years, kind of a growing perception of unfair trade practices in China. So it's, it's state-owned enterprises getting subsidized electricity costs. It's undervalued currency for much of the last 20 years. And it has been a declining manufacturing in US and Europe that has been, a political backlash created. President Trump put tariffs on Chinese goods because of this pressure. Interestingly, President Biden has not taken them off. So it's kind of both a Republican and a Democratic response. Europe is doing some of the same things. So that was kind of the backdrop of making the globalization model more under stress. But two new things have happened. One was COVID, and COVID, the companies have been, blaming each other for spreading the virus. The Australia wanted the, WHO to do an investigation of Wuhan, and people were, investigations were being blocked. More importantly, was prioritize national interests. Some countries blocked PPE exports, personal protective equipment were blocked. It's not just China. What's the vaccine made at Oxford? There was a company in Italy that had a contract to sell the vaccine to Australia during the beginning of the COVID outbreak. They blocked the export of the vaccine to Australia so they could keep it in Italy. And so basically the COVID kind of made countries think more and more about national priorities. Do we have what we need to keep our people safe? So this issue, the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine has really raised geopolitical tensions as well. So I think now there's more and more recognition that autocracies and democracies have different interests. Autocracies may start military action. They may put military issues ahead of economic well-being of their people. There's growing awareness that concepts like human rights, individual freedom, privacy, they may be very different in democracies than autocracies. And so I think this is a new awareness. One thing I just wanted to point out, this is Mr. Putin, and this has really, his invasion of Ukraine has really rattled the whole concept of the globalization model. The globalization model held that if we trade together, if we're foreign investment, we will conform to global behavioral, expectations. We won't invade countries. And this has really, his invasion of Ukraine has really rattled confidence. We have some data here on the right. Russia gets $87 billion a year of exports and energy to Western Europe. Overall, it exports $156 billion to Western Europe a year. The average Russian household has 15,000 of family income, household income. 20% of that is just exports to Western Europe. So it's about $3,000 of European or Russian exports go to Western Europe. Mr. Putin has basically made the calculation. It's worth giving up 1/5 of my household's income to have my military objective in Ukraine. And so this is rattling the globalization model as well. Putin has been comparing himself to Peter the Great in recent months. This gets to, is it my people, I want to have a rising living standard, or I want to have a statue of myself in Red Square? And it's looking more like the latter. And that has been rattling the globalization model. What can we see as a result of that? Increasingly, companies are using what we call a China plus one business model. So it doesn't mean I'm pulling out of China, but it means, with tension between China and Taiwan, maybe there's going to be something, if there's military action there, I don't want to be too dependent on China. So China plus one business model is now spreading around US Fortune 500 companies. So again, I don't pull out of China, but I'm not going to build a second factory in China. My next factory will be in India or Malaysia or Mexico or some other place. And then it is really countries really trying to count out, where am I going to get my supplies for EVs, for semiconductors? Am I going to be able to have a secure supply chain? And it's working both in the US and in China. China is trying to not make itself dependent on Western technology for some of these same things. I think overall an impact is going to be reduced economies of scale. So companies are now saying, if my factory in Mexico costs 5% more than the factory in China, but I have diversification, hey, I'll take it. So that's, I think that's happening. Last point is just recession risk, what a recession might mean for business. Larry Summers had this great quote. He said, every time unemployment is below 5% and consumer price index inflation is about 4%, we've had a recession in 2 years. That is really saying if the economy is overheating. With those two things together, just mean if the economy is overheating, a recession follows. And we've looked at the data from Larry, and three of the four examples are actually more than 50 years ago. So Larry's data is a little old. But the concept is that if the economy is overheating and the Fed has to do something serious about it, it typically will cause a recession, and it certainly is in our mind. Two things that we look at for recession risk in the U.S. One is the yield curve spread, so 10-year over the 3-month bond. So when the yield curve inverts, the shading is recession, inverts recession, inverts recession, inverts recession, inverts recession. And it's just about inverted now. So it's clearly a signal of something that could be signaling the recession could be coming. It's not coincidence. What this really means, the yield curve inverting means the Fed is actively raising rates to try to fight inflation. So when the Fed is actively raising interest rates to fight inflation, they typically have brought about, typically a recession has resulted. The other thing we look at is the index of leading indicators. When it hooks down, it's an indicator of recession coming, and it started to hook down. It's not hugely down, but it's down some. So we've got to keep our eye on that. And lastly, we look at Institute for Supply Management measures of manufacturing activity in different countries. So this is Germany, France, Italy, and the UK, and this is Japan, South Korea, and China. Basically, all of them have now hit zero. Almost all of them, except for Japan, all of them have hit zero. So this would say we are at risk of a global recession. That would be, it feels to me like we're probably going to have a global recession. If we did have a recession, just quickly, we've done analysis at our firm of like what industries would be affected. And so these are the industries that would be most affected in a recession. This is the average of the last 4 recessions in the US. So what gets hit hardest? Residential building, home construction, travel, non-res building, rail transportation, motor vehicles. These are the sectors that get hit hardest in a typical recession. And then what gets hit the least in a recession? Well, healthcare, educational services, insurance, food, wireless telephone companies do great in recessions. People don't give up their cell phone in a recession. So just a few thoughts on that. And I'm going to stop there, and we have time for questions, and you can disagree with what I said. Bob, wait, look, actually, Bob has to go, Bob has to go to, so I'll let him ask the first question. You can have the second. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob, for, I think, a really great briefing. I think you covered all the points pretty accurate where we are and also the causes and effects. So thank you for that. I have a question which I'm sure doesn't have a real accurate answer to it, but I'll ask it anyway. Okay, given all of this great news, where we are now, and given some of the history that I know you folks spend a lot of time studying, not to say that necessarily repeats exactly, but as guides in trying to interpret where we are and where we're going. Do you have any ideas of how to bracket? Okay, given where we are, what timeline are we looking about for the world or the country to be able to start on the upswing again?
Yeah. So, and that's a really important point. I left on kind of a down note here. The average American recession lasts about four quarters, about 9 to 12 months. Stock market usually anticipates before the bottom is hit, and starts to rebound before the bottom gets hit. So the beauty of capitalism, of American capitalism, is entrepreneurs, react to price signals. Things get messed up, and then some activities get closed down that were, maybe excessive with cheap credit, and got overbuilt. But then the system resets, and entrepreneurs start new companies, hire new people, and so my best guess would be the U.S. probably does have a recession sometime between now and early 2023, like maybe third, fourth quarter of this year, first quarter of next year might start. I think 2023 is going to be kind of a rough year, but then could stock market hit bottom in spring, summer of 2023 and be up by 2024? Yeah, could. But a typical pattern would be about a year down. What we don't know, and this is the part that worries me, is I don't know what Putin's going to do next.
Yeah.
And could he get, could things get worse? Yes. Could he do, some of these other things that would really escalate the tension, geopolitical tension? Yes, he could. And it's impossible to forecast, except that he's not the guy who has a reverse gear on his gear shift. And so that's the one thing we just don't know. The other thing is we don't know. I think President Xi's probably been somewhat chastened by looking at the world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that may put more thinking in his head about, do I invade Taiwan sooner or not? But we know that he wants to bring Taiwan into China, and is happy to do, is playing military action to do that. So that's the other part that we don't. So there are some wild cards out there. Those are two of the biggest ones. What does Putin do next, and what happens to Taiwan? It could make things worse.
No, that's a good point, but Putin as a country versus China as a country, in terms of his impact on global economy, is like a rather small country. Some states have more economy than he has.
Yeah, Russia's
So he's
China,
not a real driver in terms of the economy, although he's having an impact, obviously, in terms of
commodity prices
instability.
and energy. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Bob.
Yeah, two questions. One on unemployment, the other one on inflation. Unemployment has been running about 3%, but I read a report the other day that there's a whole block, and it's growing, of men 25 to 60 who are not seeking jobs.
Yeah.
Is that report accurate? What impact does it have on the unemployment rate?
Yeah. So that actually is, it's a really interesting part of the story. So the U.S. unemployment rate today is 3.7. We get down to 3.5. And the statistic that you're talking about is what we call the participation rate. So the participation rate is the share of people who are actively working. And that is still down. It got as almost to 67% of the population was working in 2007. And it has been coming down even before COVID hit. It had been coming down, it was in the 63.5% range, and it plummeted to 60.5% when COVID hit. So people dropped out of the labor force. And we've now rebuilt about 2/3 of the people who dropped out of the labor force have come back, and about 1/3 have not. And the single biggest group of people who are not back to the labor force is actually 60-something-year-olds, people who've done early retirement. So it's like people 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, who have, many of them chose to retire early under COVID. The stock market was booming, and many of them had their 401k and were like, oh, I have 700,000 in my 401k. And then it was like, oh, I have $1 million in my 401k. It's really booming. I'll retire now. Mm-hmm. So a big debate is, do those people come back to the labor force, or are they gone forever? I suspect most of them are probably gone forever. If you've been retired for a couple of years, it's not clear that you'll go back, although some people are feeling the stress of inflation and may have to go back to work. But about the general view is that more than half of the missing workers today are these early retirees, or people who retired a little earlier than they otherwise would have. It is a challenge. The other thing is there still are health issues. I mean, there are still some of the biggest categories of work that have not come back are healthcare and like school teachers, bus drivers and stuff. And some of those probably still are being impacted by health concerns of COVID and so on.
Yeah. And my other quick question is, typically in the past, companies, organizations have used inflation rate in order to adjust wages, salaries.
Yeah.
Is that a sustainable thought these days when inflation could be 6, 8, 10%?
Yeah, it could be. It's interesting. Actually, it may be getting easier for companies to signal now. It used to be with really low inflation. Maybe you had a worker who wasn't very good, and you wanted to signal to them that they weren't really keeping up with the rest of their competitors, the colleagues, or whatever. It may have been you gave everyone a 2% raise, but you really you only give that person 1% or even 0. But the problem was you couldn't really give them -1 because that was like something you couldn't do. But if inflation is 7, you can give the good workers 9, you can give the poor worker 3. And so actually it does give more of a sorting range for businesses to segment their performers in their company. So I actually see it working in the opposite direction. I think that gives companies a little more flexibility. Yeah. Steve.
The pundits and everybody in the news always talks about recession, and as if it's like the world's going to end, we're going to fall off a cliff.
Yeah.
Personally, I think it just overplays it. It's just we're just going through a process. We go to a downturn, we work things out, we go to an upturn. But in light of kind of what everybody says, you know, when are we inflation? When are we in a recession? So on and so forth.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Yeah. So I do not think we're in a recession today, just to be clear. The layman's definition of recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP. And we had 2 negative quarters of GDP. We had a minus in the first quarter and a minus in the second quarter. But the official recessions are dated by this committee of 8 economists who are called the National Bureau of Economic Research has something they call the Business Cycle Dating Committee. And they choose the dates. Now, they are typically doing it 9 months after the recession started. They're calling it a recession, you know. But they look at 5 factors to determine whether the recession has taken place. And one is industrial production and income and consumer spending. Well, it's real consumer spending, retail sales. And so, and importantly, look at labor market and hiring. And we've looked at all 5 of those things are still in small plus direction right now. And the labor market is actually in pretty strong plus direction. So we would not call this a recession. The concern is that some of that financial stress that was hitting the lower income quintiles is now moving up to the middle income quintiles, and that will start to, you know, cause the economy to turn down and have a formal recession. One thing to remember is you raise a really good point. You say it's not necessarily black and white. Recession, you know, terrible. No recession, wonderful. We could easily have what we economists call a growth pause. A growth pause could be a year of like plus 0.5% GDP growth. It wouldn't feel great. It would be like muddling through, not great. Some people losing their jobs, some people aren't. But it's very possible we will have something like a growth pause of really low growth and doesn't feel great, but doesn't feel horrible. So yeah, Tom. Are there any, by the way, before I ask Tom, is there anyone online, Emily? Because
Dell has a question. Go ahead, Dell.
Dell.
What do you think will happen if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? 2 of the theories you've been putting out.
I think that world confidence would be shattered. I think stock markets would go down 40 or 50% really fast. And I think you would just shatter world confidence. So financial market confidence would be shattered. And so it would not be good. It is, again, this is a war of choice that he's decided to invade a country, and then if he's dropping nuclear bombs on a country, even if they're tactical nuclear and they only take out a quarter of a city, are you still killing 50,000 people? I mean, at some point, this is it's beyond the pale, and the world would probably go into a very deep recession.
What about Iran using nuclear weapons against Israel?
Well, don't know exactly, but it isn't good either, Del.
That's why I mentioned those 2.
Yeah, I think any use of a nuclear weapon at this point would be taken very badly by the world financial system, consumers. I think consumer confidence would be shattered. So it's not just stock market would go down. I think people would be less likely to buy a new car the next day. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, Tom.
Do you think it's of any value to develop a personal recession guide to see really where you are or your family is in regard to the global data that you very nicely presented?
Yeah.
Because if you try to interdict your personal situation into all of this data, you're lost.
Yeah.
Is there checklist that you go through like you do? I
So that's actually a great question. So there are basically think about your income and your consumer spending and your occupation and your the first thing that comes to my mind is if you're a working age and you're working, what is the industry that you're in? Because there are very powerful industry effects in an economic downturn. If you happen to just say, I happen to be an auto mechanic, I work for an auto company and I assemble cars, like you're in like one of the most volatile industries in the economy, and you're probably going to lose your job. If you say I'm a medical doctor, I'm a dentist, probably you're going to keep your job, although you may have some customers who can't pay their bills, for example. So you may suffer 10-20% loss of your revenue because you have customers who are falling behind on making their payments. But a lot of it's going to depend, first of all, on your choice of your occupation and whether your industry is susceptible to downturn or not. The other thing that comes to my mind, of course, is your financial assets. So it's your financial assets. Just are you heavily in stocks? Are you in? Did you invest all in buy now, pay later? Fintech stocks? Because if so, you're down about 60%. So that was another question. Unfortunately, when you have going from a period of low inflation to high inflation, and the Fed is starting to raise rates to raise inflation to battle inflation, you're talking about financial developments that hit stocks and they hit bonds, because bond yields have been artificially low for 15 years. And so you're just suffering capital loss on your bond portfolio every month when the Fed is raising rates. So it's really like there's not very many places to hide in the current environment. But yes, look at your personal. So it's your income, your sector that you're earning your income in, and then it's your then it's the value of your portfolio of what you own for assets, and then the third piece of it is your house. So a house is still a major financial asset for most American households, and if you're in Phoenix or Austin or Jacksonville or Tampa, and you're one of those markets where housing prices are up 30% last year and 30% the year before, so 60% in the last 2 years, you're probably going to be more susceptible to seeing the value of your house go down. The Washington Post had a nice little graphic about 5 days ago that showed where housing markets are suffering the most. It had counties, and Washington was still green. I mean, Washington and most of the Northeast was still kind of green, which meant housing prices here are falling less than in Texas and Arizona. California was all red. Salt Lake City was red. Boise, Idaho was red. Texas was red. Florida was red. They had 6 measures of housing market pressure, like how many days a house stays on the market before it sells, that kind of stuff. And the southern tier, the Sun Belt was basically red, and the Rust Belt was basically green.
Rob, I think we have time for one more question, and Kim Belvin online had a question, and then we'll wrap up.
Kim.
Hi, you already answered our question.
Question was what you forecast would happen with housing prices.
So thank you.
How about your thoughts on Jerome Powell and how he's handling things going forward? Do you think he's doing the right thing?
Yeah, so Jerome Powell, I try to keep this not on the individual per se, but I always thought that someone with more economics training would be useful running the Fed, like the Alan Greenspan model. Bernanke, Janet Yellen, they had careers in economics and had been studying the economy. Jay Powell was a lawyer by training. I feel that the Fed was behind the curve on getting the inflation signals right. I mean, I remember having conversations with people in like April of 2021 and saying, everything that we're seeing is screaming, make more inflation, make more inflation. And the Fed wasn't even talking about inflation. And then, so, I feel like they missed signals. And a lot of it was $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus that put a lot of money in people's pockets, and the money was coming out. And
But you did say during your conversation is that you thought he's finally getting on board and they're heading the right way now.
yeah, I think the Jackson whole speech he gave at the end of August was a clear turning point. You know, he started using much more serious language about we have to get really serious. We're not going to let up. We're going to make sure because the Fed loses the fight against inflation, it's really lost its credibility, and that's a real problem.
Great. Rob, thank you so much. Next week, we're going to be looking at Taizé, the Taizé community. It's a contemplative, ecumenical worshiping community, and we have a guest who will be with us from Germany, who's just recently returned from Taizé, and he'll share his experiences of annual pilgrimage there and what the community has to offer. So join us for that online or in person, and we'll go off to worship.
Thanks. Thanks.
Thank